It was one of those evenings when the rain didn't pour hard, but enough to make everything look blurred outside the cafe windows. The city lights flickered softly on the wet streets and people rushed by with umbrellas in their hands, trying to stay dry. Inside the small cafe at the corner, the atmosphere was warm and calm. The smell of freshly baked pastries mixed with the soft sound of jazz playing from a speaker behind the counter. The place was not fancy. It had wooden tables, a few worn-out chairs, and an upright piano placed near the window. Every evening someone would come and play for the customers. Sometimes it was an old man who loved classical pieces, and other times it was a young student who came to practice for a few extra bucks. But that evening the piano stood silent. The person who was supposed to perform hadn't shown up. The owner of the cafe, a kind man in his late 50s, kept looking at the door, hoping the performer would arrive. He had promised his customers live music, and the cafe was more crowded than usual because of the rain. People wanted a cozy place to sit, talk, and listen. He sighed and checked his phone again, but there was still no message from the pianist. At one of the back tables near the window sat a woman who didn't seem to belong to any of the chatting groups. She wore a faded brown coat, her hair slightly messy from the rain. Her face looked calm but tired, like someone who had seen too much in life and stopped talking about it. She had ordered a small cup of tea that had gone cold, but she didn't touch it. Her gaze often drifted toward the piano and then back to the window. No one noticed her much. She looked like any ordinary person trying to get away from the rain. But if someone had looked closer, they might have seen the faint movement of her fingers as if she was quietly playing something in her mind. The owner walked around nervously. The cafe was filling up and people had started asking when the music would begin. He smiled awkwardly and told them the performer was running late. He went to the back counter, talking with one of his staff members about what to do. That's when an older man sitting near the front spoke up. "Why don't you ask someone here to play?" he said, half joking, half serious. "There must be someone who knows how to play a few notes." A few people laughed, but the owner thought about it for a second. He raised his voice slightly and said, "If anyone here can play the piano, you're welcome to come up and give us a little music. We'd all appreciate it." The cafe grew quiet for a moment, then people went back to their conversations. No one moved. Everyone assumed someone else would step up, but no one did. The woman by the window looked down at her cup. Her hands trembled slightly. She hadn't touched a piano in years. Not in front of people, at least. The last time she had played in front of an audience, her name had been printed on posters and the hall had been filled with hundreds of people waiting to hear her music. But that was a lifetime ago. She didn't plan to play again. Not after what had happened. Not after everything she'd lost. Still, her heart started to beat faster as the owner spoke again, this time sounding more desperate. "Just a few minutes of music," he said with a smile. "We'll even give you free coffee." A few people chuckled and someone at the back shouted, "Play something romantic." The cafe was turning the silence into humor, but she could feel her pulse in her throat. The piano keys looked almost alive from where she sat, as if they were calling her name. Then from the counter, the older man who had first spoken up noticed her. He had been watching quietly, and maybe it was the way she kept glancing at the piano that gave her away. He tilted his head and said gently, "Miss, you look like you know your way around a piano. Would you like to give it a try?" Every head turned toward her. For a moment she froze. She wasn't used to being the center of attention anymore. Her voice came out quiet, almost unsure. "Oh no, I haven't played in a long time," she said softly. The man smiled kindly. "That's all right. Music doesn't forget the hands that loved it once." Something about his words made her heart ache. She looked down again, unsure what to say. The owner stepped closer and said in an encouraging voice, "Even one small song will make this rainy evening better." She looked around. Everyone was smiling, waiting. No one knew who she was. To them, she was just a quiet woman in a brown coat. And maybe that was a good thing. Maybe this was her chance to play without the weight of expectations or judgment. Her throat felt dry as she stood up slowly. The chair made a soft sound against the floor. People clapped lightly as she walked toward the piano. Her shoes were still wet from the rain, and she could hear the faint squeak with every step. When she reached the piano, she hesitated for a moment. The wooden bench was cold under her hands. She sat down carefully, her back straight but tense. Her reflection stared back at her from the shiny surface of the piano lid. She looked older than she remembered. The cafe grew quiet again. The owner dimmed the lights a little. Even the rain outside seemed softer now. She took a deep breath and lifted her hands over the keys. The piano wasn't in perfect shape. A few notes were slightly out of tune, but she didn't mind. Her fingers hovered above the keys like old friends meeting again after years of silence. She pressed the first key, a single, trembling note, and then another. The sound was hesitant at first, fragile, like her heart wasn't sure if it was ready to open again. But then something shifted inside her. Her fingers began to move more naturally, flowing from one note to another. The melody grew stronger, filling the cafe with a soft warmth that silenced even the quiet chatter in the corners. No one spoke. Every person in that room turned their head toward her, as if drawn by invisible strings. The notes she played were not fast or loud. They were calm, deep, full of emotion. It was the kind of music that didn't just fill the air. It filled hearts. The owner stood near the counter, his hands frozen in mid-motion, holding a tray. The barista stopped wiping cups. A couple sitting near the door held hands without realizing it. Even the old man who had invited her to play had a tear shining in his eye. She closed her eyes as her fingers danced over the keys. In that moment, she wasn't the woman who had lost everything. She wasn't the fallen pianist who had been betrayed and forgotten. She was simply someone who loved music, someone whose soul spoke through sound. The song went on for several minutes. It told a story without words, of beauty and heartbreak, of rising and falling, of loss and rediscovery. Every note carried a piece of her past. Every pause felt like a breath of healing. When she finally stopped, the last note lingered in the air before fading softly. For a second, there was silence. The kind of silence that only happens when people are too moved to speak. Then the cafe erupted in applause. Loud, heartfelt, endless applause. She opened her eyes, startled. People were standing, clapping, cheering. Some had tears, others were smiling. The owner came closer, his face glowing with gratitude. That was beautiful, he said quietly. Where did you learn to play like that? She gave a small smile. It's been a long time, she said. Her voice was soft, almost like a whisper. The older man at the counter smiled knowingly. Well, he said, it was worth the wait. She nodded politely, stood up, and returned to her table. Her heart was still racing, but in a different way now. Not from fear, but from something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. People kept talking about her performance for the rest of the evening. They guessed who she might be. Maybe a retired music teacher, maybe someone who once studied at a conservatory. No one really knew, and she didn't tell. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street shimmered under the streetlights. She looked out the window, watching people pass by, feeling something inside her begin to stir again. It wasn't pride or ambition. It was something purer, the quiet realization that music still lived in her, no matter how much time had passed. When she finally left the cafe, the owner thanked her again and told her she was welcome to come back any time. She smiled, pulled her coat tighter, and stepped into the cool night air. Her shoes splashed softly in the puddles as she walked away. Behind her, through the glass window, the piano sat waiting. It looked different now, alive, awake, as if her music had brought it back to life too. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was running from her past. She just walked quietly, her heart lighter, her fingers still tingling from the keys. She didn't know if she would ever play again in front of people, but that night had reminded her of something she thought she had lost forever, the power to move others through the simple language of music. And somewhere deep inside, she smiled at the thought that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. After that rainy night at the cafe, life seemed a little different for her. She still woke up early, still walked to the same small grocery store where she worked part-time, and still came home to her quiet apartment at the end of each day. But something inside her had shifted. The sound of the piano from that evening still played softly in her mind, like an echo that refused to fade. Every morning when she poured her coffee, her fingers would tap the table unconsciously as if searching for invisible keys. Music had always lived inside her, but for a long time she had buried it beneath the weight of disappointment and pain. That night in the cafe had opened a door she thought she had locked forever. At the grocery store, her co-workers didn't know anything about her past. To them, she was just a quiet woman who worked efficiently, smiled politely, and never spoke much about herself. But that week, even they noticed something different about her. She hummed softly while stocking shelves, sometimes tapping her fingers in rhythm on the counter. It was small, but it was enough to make them smile back at her. After work, she began walking by the cafe again. She didn't always go inside, but she often stopped for a few seconds outside the window, listening to whoever was playing that night. Most of the time, the music was simple, cheerful songs or soft jazz, but it always made her remember how it felt to sit at that piano and lose herself completely. A few evenings later, she finally went inside. The cafe owner recognized her immediately and his face lit up. "You came back," he said warmly. "Everyone's been talking about that night you played. You have no idea how much it meant to people." She smiled shyly. "I'm glad they liked it," she said. He leaned closer and whispered, "They didn't just like it, they loved it. Some people even asked when you'd be playing again." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Oh, I don't really perform anymore. That was just something in the moment." The owner looked at her thoughtfully but didn't push. "Well," he said, "if you ever feel like playing again, the piano's always here for you." She thanked him and sat near the window again, just like before. The music that evening was gentle and nice, but something about the way the pianist played reminded her of her younger self, full of dreams, not yet touched by betrayal or heartbreak. As she sipped her tea, memories started to return, not in full, but in flashes. She remembered the stage lights, the applause, the feeling of her heart racing as she bowed to the audience. She remembered how proud her parents had been when she first won a music competition at 15. She remembered the long hours of practice, the blisters on her fingers, and the way her teacher used to say, "You don't play with your hands, you play with your soul." And then came the memories she tried to forget. The pressure, the criticism, and the betrayal that had shattered everything she worked for. Years ago, she had trusted someone who promised to help her grow in her career. He was charming, confident, and seemed to believe in her talent. Together, they performed at different venues, and slowly she began gaining recognition. But when success started to come, so did jealousy and competition. Behind her back, lies began to spread, false stories about her stealing music and taking credit for others' work. At first, she thought people would see through it. But rumors have a strange power. They travel faster than truth. Within weeks, she lost her sponsorships, her invitations to perform, and her confidence. Even her closest friends began to doubt her. The man she trusted disappeared, leaving her to carry the blame. The day she walked away from the stage, it felt like losing a part of her soul. She sold her piano, packed her things, and moved to a different city where no one knew her name. For years, she avoided anything that reminded her of music. But no matter how far she ran, she could never completely silence the sound that lived inside her. That rainy evening in the cafe had changed something. It wasn't just the applause. It was the realization that she could still move people, even without fame or recognition. It was pure, honest, free from judgment. One night, about a week later, she passed by the cafe again. The lights were dimmer that evening, and when she peeked through the window, she saw that the piano was empty. The owner spotted her from behind the counter and waved eagerly. "You came at the perfect time," he said as she stepped inside. "Our pianist canceled again. Do you think, maybe?" She hesitated for only a moment before nodding slowly. Something inside her wanted to play again, not for anyone's approval, but simply because it made her feel alive. She sat down at the piano once more. The crowd wasn't large this time, just a few people reading books, a couple sharing dessert, and a small family by the door. But the moment her fingers touched the keys, everything else faded. This time, the music was different, softer, more hopeful. The melody carried warmth like sunlight breaking through clouds. People stopped talking and turned to listen. Even the little boy at the family's table put down his cookie and stared. When the song ended, the cafe filled with applause again, though smaller, gentler. The owner smiled at her and whispered, "You make people feel something they didn't know they were missing." She blushed slightly and whispered back, "I just play what I feel." From then on, she began visiting the cafe more often. Sometimes she played for just 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. The regular customers started recognizing her. They would smile and wave whenever she arrived, grateful for the peace her music brought. Word slowly began to spread. A few people took short videos of her playing and posted them online, calling her the mysterious pianist at the corner cafe. The clips were simple, just her hands moving gracefully over the keys, the soft glow of the cafe lights and the calming sound of her music. But people online were drawn to it. Comments began pouring in. Her music feels like a warm hug. I don't know who she is, but this is beautiful. This sound makes me want to close my eyes and just breathe. She didn't know about the posts at first. She didn't use social media anymore. But when the cafe owner showed her one of the videos, she smiled in quiet disbelief. She had run away from fame for so long, yet here it was finding her again. Not in the way it used to, but softly, kindly, without pressure. Still, she kept her identity private. She never told anyone her full name. To the cafe regulars, she was simply the pianist who came and went like a gentle breeze, leaving beauty behind. One evening after she finished playing, an older woman approached her. Her eyes were kind, her voice trembling slightly. "My husband passed away 2 years ago," she said softly. "He used to play the piano for me every night. When I heard you tonight, I felt like he was here again. Thank you." The pianist's eyes filled with tears. She reached out and gently squeezed the woman's hand. "I'm so glad the music brought you comfort," she said. Moments like that made her realize that her gift still had purpose. She didn't need a big stage or critics to prove her worth. The true power of music was in the way it touched people's hearts. Quietly, deeply, without words. But even as her music began to reach others again, there was still a small ache inside her, a piece of her past she hadn't fully faced. Sometimes late at night she'd sit by her window, staring at the city lights, wondering if anyone from her old life had ever forgiven her, or even remembered her side of the story. Yet for now, she was content with the peace she had found. Every note she played was a step toward healing, every melody a reminder that what's broken can still create beauty. As winter approached, the cafe became busier. More people came to listen to her play. The piano, once silent and dusty, had become the heart of the place. And she, the woman who once hid from the world, was becoming part of a new story, one built not on fame or reputation, but on connection and kindness. What she didn't know was that soon, someone from her past would walk through those cafe doors, and everything she had tried to leave behind would rise again. Not to destroy her this time, but to test how much she had truly healed. For now, though, she played, and as her fingers moved over the keys, her eyes softened, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The music drifted out into the street where people walking by paused to listen, smiling quietly to themselves. The woman who had once been silenced by pain was learning, note by note, how to find her voice again. The winter air had grown colder, and the cafe's windows often fogged up from the warmth inside. It had become a favorite spot for many in the city. Some came for the coffee, but most came hoping to hear the mysterious woman play. No one knew her story, but everyone felt something when she sat at that piano. Her music carried both sadness and hope, like it had lived through storms and found calm again. She never stayed after playing. When the last note faded, she would quietly thank the cafe owner, gather her coat, and slip out into the cold evening. Her life outside the cafe was still quiet. She lived alone in a small apartment with walls thin enough to hear the sounds of the city at night. Cars passing, dogs barking, neighbors laughing. Sometimes, when she couldn't sleep, she'd sit by the window with a cup of tea and think about how strange life could be. One day, while she was at work, a young man came to the grocery store. He looked around, then stopped when he saw her arranging the fruit section. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Are you the pianist who plays at the cafe on Main Street?" She looked up, surprised. "Oh," she said softly. "I sometimes play there, yes." He smiled widely. "I knew it was you. I recognized your hands. My mother and I come there often. Your music reminds her of my father. He used to play too." Her face softened. "That's kind of you to say," she replied. He nodded, still smiling. "She listens to your videos online every night before bed. It helps her sleep." "Videos?" she asked, surprised. "Yes," he said. "People record you. There are so many views. You're becoming a bit of a mystery online." She didn't know what to say. Part of her was touched, but another part felt uneasy. She had wanted peace, not attention. After the man left, she went about her work quietly, but her mind was spinning. That night, curiosity got the better of her. She borrowed a coworker's phone and searched for the cafe's name. There they were, videos of her sitting at the piano playing under the warm yellow light. The comments were full of love and wonder. People called her the hidden pianist, the woman with the golden touch, and the soul who plays like she's healing the world. She read the messages slowly, one after another. Some people wrote about how her music helped them through heartbreak or loneliness. Others said it gave them peace during sleepless nights. Tears filled her eyes. For so long she had believed her music was lost, meaningless. Now she realized it still had power, not to make her famous, but to reach hearts. The next time she went to the cafe, she felt a little different. She sat at the piano with a small smile, not of pride but of quiet gratitude. The audience that night was larger than usual. A few people even held their phones up, recording as she began to play. But she didn't let it distract her. She played softly, her music flowing like water, honest and pure. Afterward, people clapped and thanked her. A little girl came up and said, "Your music sounds like the sky when the rain stops." The woman knelt down, smiling warmly. "That's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said," she whispered. The cafe owner noticed how much people adored her, but he also saw the sadness that sometimes lingered in her eyes. He wanted to ask about her past, but he never did. He felt she would share it when she was ready. Days turned into weeks and winter deepened. Snow began to fall and the city lights reflected off the white streets. One evening, as the cafe filled with laughter and warmth, the door opened and a man walked in, shaking the snow from his coat. He looked around, and when his eyes met hers, time seemed to stop. She froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that face. It was from another life, the one she had tried so hard to forget. He was the same man who had once promised to guide her career, who had stood beside her when she was at her highest, and who had turned away when lies surrounded her. He looked older now, more tired, but his eyes still carried that same sharpness she remembered. He stared at her for a moment, clearly shocked to see her there. Then he smiled faintly and approached. "I can't believe it's you," he said softly. She looked down, her hands trembling slightly. "I thought I'd never see you again," she murmured. "I didn't think I would either," he replied. "But then I saw a video online of you playing here. I recognized your style immediately. You haven't changed." Her chest tightened. She wanted to tell him that she had changed, that she wasn't the same person who once stood on stages and believed every promise he made. But she stayed silent. He took a seat beside her at the piano. "You're incredible," he said gently. "You always were. I'm sorry for everything that happened back then. I should have spoken up for you. I let people believe lies and it ruined everything." She swallowed hard. For years she had imagined this moment, the apology she never thought would come. Now that it was here, she didn't know what to feel. "I lost everything because of that," she said quietly. "My career, my friends, my trust. I thought I'd never play again." He looked down at the keys. "I know, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." The cafe was still buzzing with chatter around them, but it felt like they were in their own world. After a long silence, he said, "You could come back, you know. People would love to hear you again. I could help you rebuild your name." She shook her head. "No, I don't want that anymore. I don't play for fame now. I play because it makes me feel alive again. That's enough." He studied her face and realized she meant it. The fire that once burned for recognition had turned into something gentler, something purer. He nodded slowly. "Then I'm happy for you," he said softly. "You found what really matters." She looked at him, her eyes calm. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said. "Not for your sake, but for mine. Holding anger would have only kept me from music forever." He smiled faintly, his eyes wet. "You've become stronger," he said. She stood up and took a small breath. "No," she said quietly, "just freer." That evening, when she began to play again, the man sat at a corner table listening. The melody she played wasn't sad anymore. It was full of peace, like someone closing an old chapter with grace. The crowd felt the emotion in every note, even if they didn't know the story behind it. Afterward, the man left quietly, but not before leaving a small note on her table. When she unfolded it later, it read, "Thank you for reminding me what real music feels like." She folded the paper and smiled softly. As days passed, she noticed that something inside her had changed again. Seeing him hadn't reopened old wounds, and it had healed them. The past no longer had power over her. She began writing her own songs again, pieces that reflected her journey, the loss, the rediscovery, and the peace she found in simplicity. The cafe owner encouraged her to record them, but she just laughed. "Maybe one day," she said. "For now, I just want to play." Her music grew even more heartfelt. Listeners described it as music that feels like forgiveness. People came from other cities just to see her perform. She never introduced herself or gave speeches. She let her piano speak for her. One night, a journalist showed up asking for an interview. "People want to know your name, your story," he said. "You've touched thousands." She smiled kindly and replied, "They already know my story. It's in the music." He looked puzzled, but he understood enough not to press further. By spring, the snow had melted and the cafe's windows were open again, letting in the soft evening breeze. She sat at the piano, her hands gentle, her heart steady. The same older man who had first asked her to play months ago came up to her and said, "You've brought life back into this place. Do you realize that?" She smiled warmly. "This place brought life back into me," she replied. Outside, the street was filled with the sound of people talking, cars passing, and laughter drifting in the air. Inside, her music blended with it all, a reminder that beauty could grow even after pain. For years, she had lived in silence, afraid of being seen. But now she realized that her story wasn't one of loss, but of rebirth. The woman who once hid from her gift had returned to it, not as the person she was before, but as someone stronger, gentler, and free. And as her fingers moved across the keys that night, the melody felt like a quiet promise that no matter how much life changes, the music within us never truly disappears. The cafe had gone so quiet that even the clinking of spoons had stopped. Outside, rain trickled softly against the window, painting long silver lines down the glass. Inside, the woman sat before the piano, her fingers hovering above the keys as if they weren't sure whether to touch them. People leaned forward, curious. A few whispered to each other, expecting maybe a simple tune, something anyone could play. The cafe owner stood behind the counter, rubbing his hands nervously. He didn't know why this woman had agreed to play, but something about her calmness felt different, almost too calm, as if she'd done this before. She closed her eyes for a brief second. In her mind, she could hear the echo of old concert halls, the sound of applause, and the blinding lights that used to make her heart race. But that was a long time ago. Now she was just a woman sitting in a small cafe in front of a piano that had seen better days. Her first note was soft. It came out uncertain, almost shy, like a whisper testing the air. A few people smiled politely, thinking she might be just an amateur trying her best. But then the second note followed. Stronger, smoother, more confident. Her hands started to move with a rhythm that no beginner could ever match. Within seconds, the sound filled the room. The melody began to unfold like a story, gentle at first, like sunlight peeking through clouds after rain. Then it deepened, gaining emotion, carrying both pain and beauty at once. It wasn't just a song. It felt like a confession. Every chord carried a piece of her heart. The cafe owner froze mid-step. The chatter stopped completely. Even the hiss of the coffee machine seemed to quiet itself. People turned their heads, drawn by something they couldn't explain. Her fingers moved faster now, dancing across the keys with effortless grace. The melody rose and fell like waves, sometimes soft enough to make the listeners hold their breath, sometimes powerful enough to make them feel something deep inside. It was raw, emotional, and real. The old man who had asked her to play sat still, his eyes glistening. He recognized skill when he saw it. This wasn't a random stranger who happened to know a few notes. This was someone who had lived inside music. The emotion behind her playing told a story words could never capture. A couple sitting by the window reached out and held hands without even realizing it. A young boy stopped playing with his spoon and stared at her wide-eyed. Even the servers stood frozen, forgetting their trays. Each note seemed to speak directly to the soul. It wasn't loud or showy, but it was powerful. There was sorrow in her music, but also healing. There was regret, but also hope. It was the kind of sound that made people remember things they'd long forgotten. Their own joys, losses, and moments that shaped them. As she played, she forgot where she was. The cafe, the people, the rain, everything disappeared. She was back on stage in her memories, under the soft lights, playing like she used to when the world still believed in her. Her fingers followed instincts older than words, moving faster, slower, softer, as if guided by her heart rather than her mind. Her eyes stayed closed most of the time. When she opened them briefly, she caught a glimpse of the audience and all watching her with awe. A lump formed in her throat, but she kept going. It wasn't about impressing anyone anymore. She wasn't performing to prove herself. She was finally letting go. The melody reached its peak, a storm of emotion that seemed to rise from every regret she had ever carried. The piano keys trembled under her touch, and for a moment it felt like the whole room was breathing with her. Then, slowly, the notes softened. The storm calmed. Her fingers began to slow down, touching the keys as if comforting them. The song faded into something peaceful, almost like a prayer. When she played the final note, it lingered in the air, floating like a fragile echo. For a few seconds, no one moved. The silence that followed was almost heavy, filled with emotions that words couldn't describe. And then, without warning, applause erupted. It started with one person, the old man who had invited her to play. He stood up, clapping with a wide smile. Then the rest of the cafe joined in, their hands coming together in loud, heartfelt appreciation. It wasn't the polite kind of applause people give out of courtesy. It was the kind that comes from being genuinely touched. The woman sat still for a moment, her hands trembling slightly. She wasn't used to this anymore, then the attention, the admiration, the sound of clapping that once filled her life. But this time it felt different. It didn't feel like fame. It felt like understanding. She gave a small nod and smiled, almost shyly, then looked down at the keys again. Her reflection on the polished surface looked older, gentler and freer than she remembered. The cafe owner walked closer, still clapping, his voice breaking through the noise. That was incredible, he said softly. Where did you learn to play like that? She opened her mouth but couldn't find the right words. For years she had avoided talking about her past. It felt too painful, too complicated, so she just smiled faintly and said, "It's been a long time." Some people in the cafe wiped their eyes. Others whispered to each other, wondering who she was. A few even took out their phones, recording the moment, not wanting to forget what they had just heard. The old man leaned forward, his voice calm but curious. "You didn't just play that," he said quietly. "You lived it." She looked at him, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like hiding. There was kindness in his eyes, the kind of understanding that didn't need explanations. When the applause finally died down, people started talking again, softly, still under the spell of what had just happened. The woman stood up slowly, smoothing her coat. She thanked the cafe owner for letting her play and began to walk back toward her corner seat. But before she could sit down, a young woman approached her, holding her phone. "Excuse me," she said shyly. "I hope you don't mind. I recorded your performance. It was so beautiful." "The world needs to hear this," the pianist hesitated. She wasn't sure she wanted the world to see her again. Yet deep down she knew something had changed. This time it wasn't about fame or fear, and it was about truth. About sharing what was once buried. She smiled softly and said, "Do what you feel is right." The girl nodded with excitement, her eyes shining with admiration. The woman sat back down in her corner, watching the rain outside. The streetlights reflected in the puddles, making the whole world look like it was glowing softly. She felt a strange warmth spreading through her chest. Not pride, not relief, but peace. For years she had avoided playing in front of people. She had told herself that music only brought pain. But tonight proved something else. Music hadn't betrayed her. People had. And now, sitting in the small cafe filled with strangers who had listened with open hearts, she finally saw the difference. The piano had always been her voice, and tonight it had spoken again, not for fame, not for recognition, but for healing. As the cafe slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the owner offered her another cup of tea on the house. She accepted it, her hand still shaking slightly. From the counter, she could hear the faint hum of someone replaying the video of her performance. The melody echoed softly through the speakers like an old friend returning after years of silence. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had once been criticized, celebrated, and feared. Now they were just hers again. Not perfect, not famous, but free. Outside, the rain had stopped and the city lights flickered like stars on the wet pavement. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like hiding. She didn't even feel like running from her past anymore. She just sat there, quiet and still, knowing that something beautiful had begun again. The night she touched the piano was the night she came back to herself. And though she didn't yet know it, her music would soon travel far beyond that small cafe, carrying her story to hearts she'd never meet. For a long time after she finished playing, the cafe buzzed with quiet excitement. People were still talking about the mysterious woman who had turned an ordinary evening into something unforgettable. The sound of her music seemed to linger, in the air, soft and alive, like the last trace of a dream that refused to fade away. The old man who had asked her to play stayed in his seat, smiling to himself as if he had just witnessed something rare. The young woman who had recorded the performance looked at her phone again and again, replaying those few minutes, lost in the emotion of it. The pianist, however, sat quietly in her corner. The applause, the whispers, the admiration, none of it made her feel proud. She just felt lighter. It was strange. For years, she had carried a heavy silence inside her. But tonight, that silence had been broken. Not with words, but with music. The cafe owner came over holding a cup of tea. "You have no idea what you just did for this place," he said softly, setting the cup in front of her. "You made everyone stop and really feel something. That doesn't happen often anymore." She looked up at him with a small smile. "I'm glad they felt it," she said. "That's all I wanted." As the night went on, people began to leave one by one, still talking about what they had seen. The old man stopped by her table before leaving. He placed a small card in front of her. "You probably don't need this," he said with a gentle grin. "But if you ever want to play again, there's a small music group that meets on weekends. No pressure, no audience, just people who love sound. You'd fit right in." She looked at the card, thanked him, and slipped it into her bag. After he left, she sat for a long time, watching the last customers go. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the city quiet and glistening. When she finally walked home, she didn't take her usual route. Her feet moved on their own, leading her down old streets she hadn't visited in years. At one corner, she passed a closed-down music hall. The lights were gone, the posters faded, but she remembered standing there once, holding flowers, smiling at a crowd that had adored her. She stopped for a moment and touched the locked door. "It's over," she whispered. But this time she didn't feel sadness. She felt gratitude, because somehow life had brought her back to music, even if only for one night. The next morning, she woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing. She wasn't used to that anymore. She had very few contacts and no one called her early. She picked up her phone, and her eyes widened. There were dozens of messages, notifications, missed calls. She frowned, confused. Then she opened one of the messages. It was from the young woman at the cafe. "I hope you don't mind," the message read, "but I posted your piano video online last night. It's everywhere. People can't stop talking about it." Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked the link. There it was, a simple video filmed on a phone. The sound wasn't perfect, but her music filled the space between the small imperfections. She scrolled through the comments, unsure what to expect, and then she saw them. Hundreds of messages from strangers. This moved me to tears. I don't know who she is, but her music feels alive. This woman reminded me why I love piano. She doesn't just play, she speaks through her music. Her heart raced. It was overwhelming, not because of fame, but because people understood her again. They didn't care about her past, the rumors, the lies that once destroyed her career. They only heard the truth in her sound. She set the phone down, covered her face, and took a deep breath. It was too much, too sudden, too emotional. But deep down, something warm began to grow inside her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. By evening, the cafe owner called her. His voice was full of excitement. "You won't believe this," he said. "We've had calls all day. People want to know if you'll play again. Some even came by just to see the piano you used. It's like magic happened here." She laughed softly, unsure what to say. "That wasn't my plan," she replied. I know, he said kindly. But sometimes the best things happen when we don't plan them. He hesitated for a moment before adding, Would you consider coming back this weekend? No pressure. Just a few songs, people would love it. She looked around her small apartment. The simple walls, the worn-out books, the piano covered in a white cloth in the corner. She hadn't touched that piano in years, but last night had changed something. I'll think about it, she said quietly. After hanging up, she walked to the piano. Slowly, she lifted the cover and sat down. Her fingers brushed the keys gently. Dust floated in the evening light. She pressed a single note. It was slightly out of tune, but the sound still had a warmth that made her smile. That weekend, she returned to the cafe. The crowd was larger this time. Some people had come from other neighborhoods just to see if the rumors were true, if the mysterious pianist would play again. When she entered, people recognized her right away. But there was no shouting, no flashing cameras, just quiet admiration and respect. The old man was there too, sitting in his usual seat, smiling knowingly. The cafe owner approached her nervously. You sure you're comfortable? He asked. She nodded. Yes, I'm ready. When she sat at the piano, the entire place went silent again. This time she wasn't nervous. Her hands felt steady, her mind clear. She began with a soft tune, something new, something she had written quietly over the years but never shared. As she played, she noticed something beautiful. People weren't watching her out of curiosity anymore. They were listening, truly listening. Some closed their eyes, some smiled faintly. It felt like everyone in the room shared the same heartbeat. She finished the song, and instead of a heavy silence, the cafe filled with gentle clapping and warm smiles. The atmosphere felt intimate and real. No spotlight, no fame, no pressure. Just people and music. Afterward, many came up to her, thanking her for sharing her gift. A young man said, You reminded me that art doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be honest. That sentence stayed with her long after everyone left. Over the next few weeks, she continued to play at the cafe. Not every night, but enough that people began to call her the pianist of the corner cafe. Videos of her performances kept spreading online, but she didn't care about the numbers or attention. What mattered was how people felt. Strangers sent her letters, saying her music had helped them through grief, loneliness, or fear. One message simply said, I hadn't felt peace in a long time until I heard your song. Every word reminded her why she had loved music in the first place. It wasn't about competition or recognition. It was about connection. One evening, the old man who had first invited her to play joined her again after the show. They sat quietly for a while, sipping tea. You know, he said, life has a funny way of bringing us back to what we were meant to do. You tried to leave music, but it found you anyway. She smiled softly. I guess it never really left me. I just forgot how to listen. He nodded, looking at her with a kind of quiet pride. You found your way back, and you did it not with fame but with heart. That night, as she walked home, the city lights shimmered across puddles from a fresh drizzle. The world looked brighter somehow. She could hear faint music in her head, the same melody she had played at the cafe, but now it sounded lighter, freer. Her steps matched the rhythm, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was walking away from something. She was walking toward something new. In the coming days, the cafe became known not just for its coffee, but for its soul. People said it felt different there, as if the music had changed the air. And every time she sat at that piano, the same hush would fall, the same warmth would fill the room, and strangers would become silent friends, connected by sound. She had once played for fame, for audiences that judged her every move. Now she played for hearts, and in return hers finally healed. Weeks turned into months, and the small cafe by the corner slowly became something special. It was no longer just a place for coffee and quiet conversations. It became a place where hearts came to rest. People came from near and far, not to meet anyone famous, but to feel something real. They came to hear the pianist who played like she was telling the story of life itself. The woman never advertised herself, never told anyone her name, and never tried to explain her past. She didn't have to. Her music spoke louder than anything she could have said. Each time she sat before the piano, people felt as if time slowed down. The sound of her fingers brushing the keys, the way she leaned into each note, the emotion she poured into her melodies, it all felt like magic. One evening, as the cafe lights glowed softly, the owner came to her with a bright smile. "You've changed this place," he said warmly. "Before, people came here to escape their day. Now they come here to feel alive." She smiled gently, her eyes drifting toward the piano. "I think music does that," she said. "It helps people remember they're still human." That night, she played a song she had been working on for weeks. It had no title, no clear structure. It was simply a reflection of her heart, a piece born out of both pain and peace. The moment she began, the entire cafe fell silent, as if the world outside didn't exist. The notes moved slowly at first, fragile and trembling, like the first steps of a child. Then they grew stronger, braver, rising into something beautiful. People listened in awe. Some smiled softly. Others wiped tears without knowing why. Her music didn't just entertain, it healed. When she finished, there was that familiar pause before applause, a quiet moment where everyone just sat with what they had felt. After the performance, a little boy came up to her. He couldn't have been older than 8. He held a small notebook in his hand and said shyly, "I want to learn piano like you." She smiled and bent down to his level. "Then you must promise me something," she said gently. "What?" he asked. "Never play for applause," she said. "Play because it makes you happy. The rest will come." He nodded seriously and she laughed softly, touching his shoulder before sending him back to his parents. Moments like that became her favorite part of the evenings. The quiet conversations, the unexpected connections, the way music made strangers care for one another. She often thought back to her past life, the bright lights, the roaring crowds, the pressure to be perfect, and realized how far she had come. She no longer needed grand stages. This little cafe with its uneven chairs and the hum of conversation had become her stage. One day, a journalist came by. He had heard about the disguised pianist who played without revealing her name. He asked the cafe owner if he could interview her. She was hesitant at first, but the owner convinced her that maybe it was time people heard her story, not the gossip from years ago, but the truth. When the journalist sat down with her, he asked softly, "Why did you stop playing all those years ago?" She paused for a long moment before answering. "I didn't stop," she said. "I just forgot why I started." He looked at her curiously. "And what brought you back?" She smiled faintly. "Life," she said. "Sometimes when you lose everything, you learn what truly matters. I thought my career was over, but music wasn't my career. It was part of who I am. You can't lose that." The article came out a week later. It didn't name her. It simply told the story of a woman who found her way back to music after life had broken her. The piece spread quickly, touching people everywhere. Readers sent messages to the cafe saying the story gave them courage to start over, to paint again, to write again, to dream again. She was amazed by how many lives her simple music had touched. But what meant the most to her wasn't the attention. It was the quiet moments after her performances, when people stayed behind to thank her, not for her talent, but for reminding them that beauty still existed in the world. One rainy evening, almost exactly like the night she first played in that cafe, she arrived to find the place packed. The air buzzed with anticipation. The owner looked both nervous and excited. "There's someone here tonight you might want to meet," he said mysteriously. She gave him a puzzled look, but he only smiled and pointed toward a table near the front. Sitting there was a woman she hadn't seen in years, an old friend from her concert days. Back then, that friend had been the only one who believed her when the rumors and lies had ruined her name. The sight of her brought back a rush of emotions. Her friend stood up and came over, her eyes glistening. "I never stopped believing in you," she said softly. The pianist didn't know what to say. She simply hugged her tightly. The noise of the cafe faded into the background as the two women stood there, holding on to a friendship that had survived distance and time. That night's performance was special. Every note she played carried memories. The joy of her early days, the pain of her fall, and the quiet strength of her rebirth. When she finished, her old friend was crying, clapping harder than anyone else. The entire cafe rose to their feet, their applause echoing off the walls. For the first time in years, she felt proud again, not of being a performer, but of being herself. The next morning, she walked along the city streets, her coat pulled tight against the breeze. She stopped in front of a music school. Through the window, she saw children sitting at small pianos, their faces full of curiosity. Something stirred inside her. She stepped inside. The school principal recognized her instantly, even though she hadn't performed publicly in years. "It's an honor to meet you," he said. "Would you like to teach here?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. "Yes," she said. "I think I would." Teaching brought a new kind of joy. Watching young students discover the language of music reminded her of her own beginnings. She taught them not just how to play, but how to feel, how to let music speak from within. Her students adored her. They said her lessons didn't feel like lessons. They felt like stories told through sound. The cafe owner visited her sometimes, joking that she had become a celebrity again. But she would laugh and shake her head. "No," she'd say, "I'm just where I'm meant to be." Her fame grew quietly again, but this time it didn't come from posters or big shows. It came from hearts, from people whose lives she had touched without even trying. Years later, she still played at the cafe from time to time. The piano had been replaced with a newer one, gifted by people who loved her music. But she still preferred the old, slightly uneven keys of the first one. One evening, as the sun set through the cafe window, the same old man who had once invited her to play returned after months away. He looked older now, his step slower, but his eyes still kind. He sat near the counter and waited until she finished her song. When she saw him, she smiled and went over to greet him. "You kept your promise," he said softly. She tilted her head. "What promise?" "To never let your gift die," he said. "You brought it back to life, King, and you shared it with all of us." Her eyes softened. "You were the one who gave me the courage that night," she said. "If you hadn't asked me to play, I might still be hiding." The old man smiled faintly. Sometimes all someone needs is a small push in the right direction. They sat together in silence for a while, listening to the gentle chatter of the cafe and the faint hum of the piano in the background. The air was calm, peaceful, the kind of peace that comes only after a long storm has finally passed. That night, as she played her final piece, she looked around the cafe, at the people listening, at the laughter, at the warmth glowing from every face, and felt something deep inside her settle completely. She had come full circle. The music that had once broken her had now healed her. The silence that had haunted her was now filled with harmony. She had found her way back, and not to fame, not to perfection, but to truth. As the final note faded into the night, she closed her eyes and whispered a quiet thank you. To life, to the people who believed in her, and to the music that had never truly left her. In that small cafe, under the soft light and the gentle hum of conversations, her story found its home. She didn't need stages or crowds anymore. Her masterpiece wasn't one song. It was the life she had rebuilt, one note at a time,